Good afternoon. Welcome to the first webinar organized by the Hong Kong ESG Reporting Awards. The topic of our panel discussion this afternoon is ESG in perspective of pandemics. My name is Tony Wong, and I will be serving as your moderator today. I'm the founder at Alaya Consulting. We pride ourselves as the trusted advisor on ESG, from reporting, GRI certified training, through to setting science-based targets and promoting board governance on ESG. About today's topic, we are all very concerned about COVID-19. While corporates have already been dealing with the risks and opportunities posed by climate change, it appears inevitable that COVID-19 will have a permanent impact on the way businesses think and communicate about E, S, and G. And these are challenges that will be applicable to every business, whatever its size and wherever it is located. We have seen many corporate reports have already increased disclosure on preparedness and response to COVID-19. The purpose of today's panel discussion is therefore to provide insights regarding how pandemic risk will have an impact on ESG, and not just from a reporting perspective, but also from the investment and policy-making perspectives. You'll be hearing the views and perspectives from the industry experts on this very timely subject. But before we started, I wanted to take a few minutes of your time. Next slide. As the organizer of the Hong Kong ESG Reporting Awards, we have launched HERA Community in early this year. By setting up this community, we aim to bring together corporations and professionals that advocate and exercise best practices in ESG, creating a platform for experience sharing and inspiring for sustainable businesses. Becoming a community member is extremely easy. Just submit your application to Hong Kong ESG Reporting Awards before the end of July. You will then enjoy a 2-year membership, as well as a range of special promotions offered by our supporting organizations shown on this slide. For more details, please visit our HERA website. Next slide, please. Now, moving along to our panel discussion. Please welcome Tim Chen, Senior Analyst in ESG Research and Integration from Manulife Investment Management. Johnson Kong, Researcher from our Hong Kong Foundation. And James Robertson, Head of Asia, ex-China and Japan from PRI. The 3 panelists will be discussing on how ESG will be changing in perspectives of pandemics. Without further ado, the 3 panelists will introduce themselves, and I shall turn the time over to Johnson.
Thank you, Tony, for the invitation. So this is Johnson from our Hong Kong Foundation. For those who may not be familiar with us, we are a policy think tank in Hong Kong, focused on policy research on a wide range of different topics, including economic development, land and housing, education, etc. So I'm leading our research on sustainable finance mainly, and specifically on ESG. We have published a report last year on ESG reporting and investing, which have fortunately created certain positive policy impact in Hong Kong. And also we have co-authored a FSDC paper on ESG like 2 years ago, and recently the FSDC recent paper on ESG, we are also involved as well. And nowadays we are also working on a few research topics, including corporate governance and also sustainable banking. So we'll be happy to talk more about that later. Thank you.
Tim, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So this is Tim Chen from Manulife Investment Management. Manulife Investment Management is the asset management arm of Manulife Financial Group. So we manage over $400 billion of assets globally. So what we do is to help our clients to invest in different asset classes and help them to achieve a better risk-adjusted return. So my role in Manulife is as the senior analyst of ESG, working with our CIOs, portfolio managers, analysts to look into the ESG issues during our investment process. So now I'm leading the ESG efforts of Manulife Investment Management in the North Asia region. So I look forward to discussing this topic with other panelists and also to hear more from our audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Tony, and really appreciate the opportunity to join this webinar and speak and engage with the audience as well as our fellow speakers here. So my role as head of Asia, ex-China and Japan at the Principles for Responsible Investment, I'm based out of Hong Kong, and essentially I work to support our organization's members or signatories in the region. To take a step back, the PRI itself is one of the world's leading proponents of responsible investment. So we're an investor initiative of over 3,000 institutional investors and service providers who commit essentially to 6 principles focused around the development and implementation of a more structured approach to ESG incorporation in investment and ownership decisions. So as an organization, the mission that we have, we believe that an economically efficient, sustainable global financial system is a necessity for long-term value creation, and such a system will reward long-term responsible investment and benefit environment and society as a whole. So our activities are really working to achieve this sustainable global financial system by encouraging adoption of the principles, collaboration on their implementation with investors and other stakeholders, fostering good governance, integrity, and accountability, and trying to address the obstacles to a sustainable financial system as well. So my role is in supporting that work in Asia, supporting our members in the region, but also engaging with interested institutional investors to help them build awareness around this and undertaking other capacity building with stock exchanges, regulators, industry associations, and other groups. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you, James. Before handing the time over to panelists for their speeches, we will have the first poll for today's panel discussion. Please select your answer. The question is, since the outbreak of COVID-19, how would you rate the importance of ESG in your company/organization? You can select very important, important, not important at all, and I don't know. Please select your answer. Okay, let's share the results. Okay, more than nearly 90% of respondents rated ESG has become important and very important since the outbreak of COVID-19. Well, I think that's exactly why we have this panel discussion today. All right, so thank you very much for showing the result. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any question during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Q&A box. We will have a Q&A session at the end to answer your questions. So I shall now turn the time over to James.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tony. So before speaking specifically around COVID and the investor response, I wanted just to maybe take a little step back and start by highlighting, particularly with respect to responsible investment in Asia, this has really been a relatively new concept for most of us, most investors, but also a lot of corporates as well. And over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen in this area a drastic increase in the level of attention that's being paid to this by investors as well as by other stakeholders. In particular, this is seen along themes like climate change, but there is a number of other issues which are really emerging as hot topics as well. And while we don't have data on the total size of responsible investment or sustainable investments in Asia at this point, at the PRI as a membership organization, we've seen a significant increase in the number of our signatories coming from this region. So this has included asset owners like Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Ping An Group, AIA Group, GPF Thailand, the Employees Provident Fund of Malaysia, but also leading investment managers, including many of the largest Chinese fund managers such as Harvest and eFund, but also those like Eastspring Investments, Fullerton, Lion Global Investors in Singapore, and Value Partners Group in Hong Kong. So this has really been something that is picking up traction. And though many are early in their RI journey in terms of the implementation itself, there's been this growing recognition of the value and the need to develop a structured approach to this incorporation of material ESG issues into investment processes and practices. So the shift is starting to happen across asset classes, in how asset owners select, appoint, and monitoring their external managers, in how engagement and proxy and voting activities are undertaken as well. So early days, but leaders are starting to emerge across the region, and this is only going to drive further competition and uptake. Alongside this, regulators and other stakeholders have been starting to take action as well. So this has been across a number of different types of approach. We've got sustainability disclosure requirements. We've got stewardship codes in a number of markets, and we've also got green or sustainable action plans, which are setting out a longer term direction, such as we've seen in Singapore and Malaysia. So against this backdrop, we've seen obviously the outbreak and ongoing impact of COVID-19 on the global scale. And though my fellow speakers will be talking to the relative performance aspect of RI funds during this period, I wanted to talk a little bit as how investors and organizations like the PRI have been responding. So the PRI has been looking to work with our members through, if we can go back one slide, apologies. The PRI has been looking to work with our members through a number of different working groups and work streams to try and identify how responsible investors should be responding. And this initially led to 7 immediate investor actions you can see on the first slide here. Active ownership or engagement plays a key function in many of these recommendations, but the overall message here has been to deal with the now. So prioritize staff, supplies and supply chains, your immediate stakeholders, but companies also need to keep their eye on the long term. And for companies themselves, they need to be ready and open to engage, not only their investors, but also their wider stakeholders, to ensure that they're aware of and addressing material issues that are arising through this pandemic, but also maintaining trust and confidence during this time of crisis as well. For investors in the region, active ownership isn't something that's as well developed as we see in Europe and North America. And so this is something we expect that will be needing to develop much further in the years ahead. Now, when it comes to the recovery itself, what are responsible investors calling for? Well, responsible investors and this investor associations like the PRI have been increasingly vocal about what they're looking for, amidst the recognition that people, profit, and planet, the 3 Ps, are both interconnected and interdependent. So you can see, if we can pop to the next slide, there has been a number of global statements or initiatives which have been put out calling for a sustainable recovery. So the one that you can see on the slide here was sent to the G20 countries and a number of other leading governments and was signed by what's called 7 founding partners of the investor agenda. So this includes the PRI, the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, the UN Global Compact, and a number of other partners. Similar statements to these have been drawn up and gained strong support in South Africa, in South America, and a number of other regions as well. And in short, what they're calling for is a recovery that is green, sustainable, and inclusive, that prioritizes both human relief and job creation, as well as the climate and biodiversity emergency that we all know is still ongoing and being overshadowed, of course, by this current crisis. So it's clear with the current government debt levels, governments alone cannot fund the recovery from COVID-19 themselves. They're going to need the private sector, and we need to work together, investors, businesses, and governments. So collaboration is going to be key here. Governments, of course, need to focus on job creation, revenue raising, and ensuring the recovery accelerates and doesn't delay action on climate change. But from the investor's perspective, and this has been heard strongly amongst our membership, we don't want to emerge from this crisis we don't want to return to normal. We want to emerge from this crisis with a plan for an economy and investment that is fit for the 21st century. In short, we must build back better. And this is a phrase I'm sure you've already heard and you will continue to hear throughout this webinar. So with that, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to hearing your questions and hearing from my fellow panelists.
Thank you, James. Tim, would you like to share your thoughts on the topic?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Tony. So James has given a very good presentation on the investor response on COVID-19, and then I will just share from Manulife's perspective, how do we think about the relevance of this crisis to investment? So first of all, we think COVID-19 is really a testament to the values of sustainable investing. As we have seen on the data from MSCI, the ESG leaders index of all regions, including Asia, outperformed in Q1 compared with non-ESG counterparts. And this is not just an equity phenomenon. The Bank of America also conducted a study showing green bonds outperform the equivalent IG bonds. So another data from Morningstar showed that ESG funds record a very significant inflow, while many other funds had outflow as more and more investors become more defensive during the crisis. So one reason for this outperformance and this inflow is because ESG funds are generally underweight in fossil fuel companies, because many of these companies perform quite poorly because of the oil price. But another more important reason that we think is actually more relevant to the discussion today is because companies have stronger ESG metrics, often have a better ESG risk management. So we think strong ESG metrics do link to business resilience. Imagine a company that has strong ESG management. They have already taken a very holistic view when considering strategic decisions. So therefore they have a more robust risk management process. If you think about COVID-19, they are affecting stakeholders across different parts of the value chains, including employees, contractors, suppliers, consumers, etc. And if you think about ESG from a stakeholder engagement perspective, then if you do the stakeholder engagement in your ESG reporting exercise, then chances are you might already have engaged with these kind of stakeholders. That's why you may be in a better position to respond or to anticipate the impact of a pandemic. So I would just give two quick examples during our interaction with companies to wrap up this part. One of our invested companies is a logistics infrastructure company. We have been investing in them for quite a long time, and if you are familiar with this sector is associated with very high health and safety risk because of the exposure to heavy equipment. So the staff and the employees there have to operate heavy equipment on a daily basis. So the company introduced automation to the operation quite a long time ago, even before the crisis began in earlier this year. So by introducing the automation into the process, the company, the original objective for the company was to reduce the safety risk. But then when the crisis emerged in this year, they also have the benefits of retaining the productivity even during the lockdown in China. So this is a advantage compared with the other companies that has not thought about ESG risk earlier in the crisis. So another example is on governance. If you are familiar with the landscape in Hong Kong, many Hong Kong companies have directors that are also the independent directors of other listed companies, and we call this situation overboarding. So overboarding has been quite an issue for some Hong Kong listed companies for quite a while, and I think this issue becomes much more obvious in COVID-19 because companies need to organize emergency board meetings to discuss the latest response or strategies responding to the crisis. So companies with less overboard directors may be able to make strategic decisions more quickly compared to companies which haven't thought about governance before the crisis. So they may be able to respond to the changing situation every day during the crisis, and they're going to allocate resources in the right time. So with that, I will just pass back to Tony to hear about from the panelists.
Thank you, Tim. Johnson, I hand the time over to you.
Thank you, Tony. It's my pleasure here today to share some of my thoughts on COVID and ESG. To start with, I think there are two major things that this pandemic has exposed or proved. And the first is the vulnerability of business, which is now fairly obvious, and Tim has touched on it a little bit as well. And the second is the great potential in business to become a solution to problems we face. And now we see we have tech companies facilitating the tracking of virus, and also having the car manufacturers to become sort of a medical supplies for us. So we see different companies coming together to solve a common problem. And that's why I hope even in the post-COVID time, if it's not too early to talk about it, we can still have companies to further strengthen both their ESG risk management as well as ESG impact management. And of course here, risk and impact, I have to say, are closely related. First of all, of course, we have risk and impact closely related in the form of having impact turn into risk. For example, if you consider carbon emission, it is obviously an impact of the company, but it can become a risk when policies such as carbon tax are anticipated. And more importantly, to address all these sustainability challenges through creating impact is also to address systematic risk. Because after all, if you think about it, there's no one who can stand alone if we destroy the environmental and social foundation of our economy, as we now see evidently in the pandemic. But of course, we know free riders always exist, and it is a little bit optimistic, or even maybe if you wish, unrealistic to hope that companies would all come together spontaneously to address all these environmental and social issues without any external intervention or push. So it's exactly where the role of policymakers comes in. And in Hong Kong, I have to say the current focus of our regulators, including the SFC and HKMA, is more on the financial risk of ESG issue instead of the impact of ESG. So, but in the same time, we have seen globally, there's some dynamic towards a more balanced perspective between ESG risk and impact. For example, in EU, we've seen the non-financial reporting directive, which requires large companies to disclose both their risk and impact. And just last year, they've formally introduced the concept of double materiality in a guideline on climate reporting, which refers to both financial materiality and also environmental and social materiality. The latter is more about the impact a company would have on the environment and society. So in contrast to the TCFD recommendations, which is more commonly known, and actually in contrast, it's entirely focused on financial materiality, the NFRD in EU actually has a more balanced perspective between risk and impact. And also apart from EU, there are a lot of international organizations pushing the agenda of impact management. Just to name a few, we have the IFC's operating principles for impact management, and also the UNDP's SDG impact standards, which are currently under development for both investors and companies. We also have the GRI, which we are more familiar with, which has developed a set of metrics for SDG reporting with the UN Global Compact. And also we have the Impact Management Project, the IMP, which is currently driving the convergence, global convergence on impact standards. Of course, we have now today James here, the PRI, which is also stepping into impact management with the project of the legal framework for impact. So by track record, we know like what PRI is doing is a good indicator of the next trend. So keep that in mind. And also, if we come back to Hong Kong, while we appreciate the regulators have embraced the agenda of ESG and they have also adopted many of the recommendations we made last year, we believe moving forward, there's a need to consider at least two major directions. The first is to really identify material issues with an industry-specific approach. So currently, if you look at the ESG KPIs we have, they are mostly quite general without much consideration of industry-specific concerns. And it's also more about operation instead of the product impact, which is more closely tied to the industry. So we believe moving forward, we need the stock exchange to develop more guidance on industry-specific issues regarding ESG and also indicators for companies to report on. We have some important reference like SASB internationally for our reference. And in fact, we are also doing a project right now to develop some metrics for certain industry for the stock exchange to take reference from. And the second is to really consider incorporating impact reporting in our ESG space. Because now if you look at the ESG KPIs, they are mostly about input or output and not much about outcome or impact, except KPI A3.1. And as the trend of impact management is growing internationally and the dynamics accumulating, I believe it's time now to consider incorporating impact reporting into the ESG space. And given that we now no longer have any more voluntary KPIs, so perhaps it's a good starting point for us to incorporate like these impact reporting requirements as perhaps a voluntary requirement for companies. So as a starting point for us to really start thinking about impact on top of just output or input reporting. So perhaps I'll stop here and I would be happy to talk more about other aspects in the panel discussion.
Thank you, Johnson. So let's get right into it with our first question for the panelists. I think Tim has touched on it a little bit. Tim, has COVID-19 accelerated ESG investing? What have investors learned from the pandemic?
Yes, thank you, Tony. So I touch on the performance and the asset inflow of ESG-related funds during the COVID-19, but then I would also like to expand a little bit on what investors can learn from the pandemic. So I think we are still in the early stages of understanding the impact of COVID-19 that we'll have, but we have already seen some important implications that are already emerging. First of all, COVID-19, I think as Johnson and James mentioned, it provides a chance for both investors and companies to review its risk resilience to systemic change. COVID-19 has clearly disrupted the economic system, and I think climate change actually represents very similar systematic risk because they could also disrupt the economic system across different industry, value chains and regions. So you will see some people even mention COVID-19 is a dry one of climate change. So if climate change and the environmental impact of climate change is going to happen in near future, then companies or investors could use COVID-19 as a chance to review its risk resilience. So that's the first point. And the second point is that I think some ESG short-term trends from the crisis may have long-term implications after the crisis. So first of all, we have a very large experiment on remote working in the crisis. So I'm working from home today because of the rising infection number in Hong Kong. And I think in terms of ESG, remote working creates a better opportunity for employees to handle other responsibility at home. So I'm sure you have the experience of hearing baby crying in the background when you are having team calls or meetings with your colleagues. So that might not be acceptable in the past, but then it should be more acceptable right now because of the crisis. So the point that I'm trying to make is that COVID-19 and the trend of remote working may boost the diversity and inclusion awareness in Hong Kong or Asia, which has been seen as a challenge in the region. And secondly, I think company will also look to diversify and also localize their supply chain because of the travel restriction. So that is quite important to the emerging market like Asia because many countries rely on exports. And I think the transition may happen sooner rather than later, also because of the US-China tension, and not just because of the COVID, but also because of the international tensions between different countries. And the final point that I would like to make is about executive compensation. So this topic has been less frequently discussed by different investors and companies in Hong Kong. I think in the crisis, many investors are expecting much lower return than comparing in a normal circumstances. So they're expecting they're expecting the company's executives to do the same or to have pay cuts so that they can show that the company management are all in the crisis together with all the stakeholders. So executive compensation will be increasingly scrutinized by stakeholders or investors. So that's why you see some CEO actively taking pay cuts during the crisis. And I think this could set the stage for revamping the compensation scheme or remuneration scheme of listed companies in Asia. In particularly for Hong Kong, I think just 2% of the Hang Seng Index constituents have linked their compensation to long-term indicators such as ESG. So in future, this may change because of the crisis, and investors are requiring companies to have a longer-term view after the crisis. So that is my comments. Thank you, Tony.
Great. And maybe if I can add to that, I mean, I think, echoing what Tim said in his presentation, both through a number of, studies, research that have been coming out that have reinforced that the flows into ESG or RI products continues to grow, and that along with the move to passive is one of the two big trends that we've seen throughout the last year, and I don't expect that to change. If anything, it will accelerate. Also, I think from my role, I get to have a lot of conversations with a lot of different players across the industry, whether it's asset owners, investment managers, service providers, and across the board, what I'm hearing, particularly from the service providers, is that there's a real step up in interest to learn more about responsible investment, but how to do this in a structured way. So really wanting to get into the technical aspects of how this is done. So that's been a very positive note that I've been hearing coming up from these conversations. In terms of what responsible investors can learn or take away from this, I think one of the things that has been most glaring that's come through this is that while E and G related factors are commonly seen as having the most impact on stock prices and corporate value, social factors certainly should not be overlooked, nor their impact underestimated. So I think as arising both from pandemic, but also some of the situation we've seen in the US around race and diversity, for example, there has been some criticism, I think rightfully leveled at the responsible investment industry about perhaps not looking at how meaningfully, should I say, S issues have been integrated into the investment processes by investors in the past. And I think this is something going forward, a lot of investors will be reviewing their policies, processes, research with respect to S issues, and trying to develop a more nuanced understanding of these and their potential impact as well. So I think that social part of ESG is going to get a lot more emphasis. And this is going to, the issues which are going to be of most relevance here will differ greatly. So it could be health and safety. It's going to be things about like remote working. Could be, I think, around executive compensation, given what we're seeing, investors accepting that underperformance. So there's a number of different issues. Diversity inclusion, particularly in the US, is going to be, and then Europe is going to be one that's of particular topical importance. So I think S in general is going to really take more prominence going forward. I'll stop there. Maybe Johnson might have something to add on this one as well.
Yeah, I just want to echo like what Tim and James has said, like on the continuous inflow of ESG like funds and also the outperformance of ESG funds like in the COVID period. And also it's quite interesting to see that there's a study from the Merrill Lynch on the ESG factor in the investment performance during COVID. And it's quite interesting to see that even after controlling the industry factor, like the outperformance persists. So perhaps that suggests that, as Tim mentioned, that the outperformance is not entirely due to the less exposure to the energy sector. So that's a very strong evidence and proof of the importance and financial materiality of ESG factors. And in fact, it's very encouraging because like in the past, like people used to be worried about whether ESG is sort of a luxury, like it's only sort of supported during time of bull market, so people have the space to do these all these works. And they are worried that perhaps there will be a retreat of ESG investment during time of crisis. And this continuous inflow into ESG funds and also the outperformance of ESG funds, I think is very important in breaking that conventional belief that there's a trade-off between creating impact and also making profit or investment return from your investment. So I think that would be the most important like takeaway for investors during this pandemic.
Right, thanks. Johnson, and the second question, I also would like you to share some thoughts. Recently, the Green and Sustainable Finance Cross-Agency Steering Group was set up. What are your thoughts on that, and what are your expectations on the steering group in addressing the ESG investing situation in Hong Kong?
Thank you, Tony. I think it's a very encouraging development because it's actually also one of the recommendations we made last year, so it's especially encouraging for us. And I have to say, like in the past, like ESG or like green finance or sustainable finance developments in Hong Kong have been quite fragmented. Like different people are doing a lot of bits and pieces and they are not very well coordinated. If you think about it, like green finance or sustainable finance is inherently a very cross-sector and cross-departmental issue. Like if you think about finance, of course, it goes to the FSTB, but if you talk about climate change, it's the EMB, the Environmental Bureau. But if you want to have access to the observatory like data, it actually has to do with the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau. So it's very cross-departmental in nature, and let alone like all the different regulators in the financial markets. So it's very important to have that platform for us to coordinate different policy efforts to really have a more coherent roadmap and facilitation of green finance development in Hong Kong. So as for expectation, I think the first thing I would say is a very detailed roadmap for green finance and sustainable finance developments in Hong Kong. That's very much needed, not just a general roadmap, but a detailed roadmap with milestone timelines and all these expectations for different like regulators and also policymakers, so that we know what we can expect from these policymakers and regulators and what they will impose on us. And that's very important for the market players in the market to really prepare ahead and also to see and expect like what, to know what they can expect from these regulators and policymakers. And the second thing would be a stronger relation between sustainable finance and sustainable development. Because if you look at the sustainable finance developments in other jurisdictions, like in the EU, like the action plan for sustainable finance in the EU is entirely tied to their commitment to a net net zero carbon emission by 2050 in the EU under the Paris Agreement. So you can see like this entirely close relationship between sustainable finance and sustainable development, that sustainable finance is a tool to serve sustainable development, especially in times of climate change. But in Hong Kong, we now see like, for example, in the climate action plan, we don't have any like sort of concrete action regarding climate finance or sustainable finance. And also there's not much mentioning of finance in our decarbonization discussion. So it's very encouraging to see that the cross-sector, the cross-agency steering group has committed to support the government's climate strategy. So that represents a linkage between finance and our real-world sustainable development on an official level. And of course, I hope to see like that kind of linkage will be further strengthened in some concrete action. For example, like the steering group has committed to develop taxonomy for Hong Kong. And we can see in EU, the taxonomy is the technical threshold entirely based on the commitment to net carbon zero by 2050. So perhaps the question for Hong Kong is, what is our climate goal and how our taxonomy will be tied to the Sustainable Development Action Plan? So this is what I would expect from the steering group.
Excellent. And if maybe I can jump in from the PRI perspective, because certainly we as an organization look to work very closely on behalf of our signatories and in collaboration with our signatories and engaging and working with many of these regulators, obviously across markets and in local markets, to try and drive policy development on wider responsible investment and also on climate change issues. So at a high level, certainly I'd echo Johnson. This is a really welcome development, in particular because it sends a clear signal that sustainable finance and green finance issues like climate change is a priority and will be a priority moving forward in the long term. So I think that signaling is incredibly important, not just in Hong Kong, but because a lot of us were paying attention to the wider region, and there's a lot of competition now heating up between financial centers, really starting to establish themselves and their criteria as green and sustainable finance hubs. And so this messaging, the signaling from Hong Kong, will also help to encourage and incentivize other regulators, other financial markets and centers to take similar action. And that, I think, bodes well for everyone in this space. I think I would also echo what Johnson was saying, that while this is a very positive signal, what we want to see coming out of this is a clear roadmap with concrete actions, policy directives, charting that path forward. And the other key part he mentioned is making sure that this isn't done in a silo. So the fact that this is across agencies is great. Collaboration is critical, as we've mentioned already, but also that this is tying into the national strategy and plans that are taking place in Hong Kong. I think, as Johnson mentioned, this is where it can be most effective, as we're seeing in the EU, where these are very much your economic and sustainable development and financial development is tied all very closely together. And so we need to see those linkages so that you can really have an understanding of the high level roadmap and how all of these different actions across sectors and industries fit together.
Thank you, James. Team, how do reporting come into play in helping investors and corporations to manage risks and emergencies such as pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Tommy. That's a good question. So I think we are seeing a wide range of reporting frameworks that are available to listed companies such as GRI, SASB, and integrated reporting. As an investor, we do not have a preference on the framework that our investee company use, as long as they report on material topics. But we also think a useful framework could go a long way in helping companies to manage risk. So in relation to your question, such as systemic risk about pandemic, one interesting thing that I saw recently is that the World Economic Forum is helping business to plan their response journey to COVID-19 by building COVID-19 scenario planning. So that makes me think of another framework called TCFD. So while TCFD is not a framework that focuses specifically on public health, the concept of strategy, governance, risk management, and measures and targets are really useful to help companies to address systemic risk like pandemic or others. So I think I foresee companies will increasingly use TCFD-like framework or concept to plan for another systemic risk, such as climate change or water risk or food security, etc.
Great. I mean, from my perspective, I think this was already mentioned by Tim at the start, but the importance itself of having and following these frameworks can then lead you to uncover and unearth potential risks and opportunities. And as you have access to this data, then you're in a much better position to respond where you have more information, essentially, where you're starting to face unexpected risks and emergencies. I think, particularly with responsible investment and in Asia itself, one of the biggest barriers for investors has often been the lack of historical comparable data. And so I think having adoption of reporting frameworks like we're seeing SASB, GRI and GRESB and others across the region is also a very welcome and positive development as well. I think at the same time, what we're also seeing, and again, we've mentioned this, Johnson mentioned earlier, is an increased recognition of the need for harmonization and clarity across these different reporting frameworks and standards. And that's something which we're starting to see as well for the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, Impact Management Project, GRI and SASB, and a number of other developments that Johnson's mentioned. I think lastly, I just echo what Tim was saying, that really we would see forward-looking frameworks and planning is a key aspect here. And so drawing on TCFD, I think, as Tim mentioned, the way that this is that is set up and structured is a very valuable approach that could also be applied and when looking at pandemics as well.
Thanks, James. Johnson, why should the board of directors be closely engaged regarding ESG governance? We all know the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has been pushing for higher involvement from the board of directors. So what role should the board play?
So a simple answer to your question is that like ESG issues are material like to the company and to all the stakeholders, especially the shareholder, like as we now see like how climate change and also like the pandemic will have material financial impact on the company. So since these issues are material, especially when we're considering financial materiality, I think it's just a job of the board to consider these issues. And as to what should the board do, as Tony, you've mentioned, like the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has been very supportive in like pushing the development of ESG governance, given the mandatory disclosure requirement now we have regarding ESG governance. And also they have recently published a guideline like for the board and directors in terms of how they should really execute their like responsibility like an ESG oversight like for the board and directors. So I won't repeat like what's mentioned already like in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange guide, as it can be like easily accessed like on the internet. What I want to mention here is what else we can expect from the board. And I think like Tim has actually just mentioned some very interesting like possible actions like remuneration policy. And in fact, in other jurisdictions, this is what we see like what is expected from the board like in terms of their corporate governance requirement. So for example, in France, we can see in the corporate governance code that the board is expected to be provided with necessary training for ESG so that they can be competent in handling ESG issues. And they are also expected to have at least one criteria related to environmental and social responsibility like incorporated in their remuneration policy. So perhaps that's something we can take reference from. And also we know like for example, France and Germany, they have heavy like worker representation on the board, but it's not the only way we can do that to incorporate like stakeholder voice into ESG governance. In UK, we can see in the corporate governance code, they have offered a diverse range of options for incorporating the workers' voice into ESG governance. For example, you can have a worker advisory panel like for the board, like so that you can hear the voice of the workers, or you can have a designated director for workers' engagement so that you can really know like what the workers are thinking and what would be material for the company and what are the important concerns you should take into account. So these are some different issues or different actions that the board can take, ranging from remuneration policy, the training for directors, and also worker representation or participation in our governance. So these are something that could be potentially taken by companies even before the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has taken any action to really require these to be done. So this is my 2 cents for this question.
Thank you, Johnson.
Maybe I would just add on that, if Tim doesn't have a comment. I think just from the investor perspective, we've really seen a lot of concern around what we call greenwashing or window dressing, where obviously as sustainability and ESG issues becomes more mainstream, how credible and how serious are both investors and the companies themselves being when they make these commitments, pledges, products, etc. around sustainability. So I think investors are becoming much more sophisticated in how they're looking at companies, and I think as has been mentioned by the others, obviously there is this expectation boards should be playing a role and be closely engaged here regarding ESG governance, but there's also then an opportunity for the company themselves to demonstrate leadership and show that they have this effective structures in place where the board is considering these levels and issues. So I think this is an opportunity to also demonstrate leadership within a company as well, and something that investors will certainly take note of as they're looking to see and kind of look at the ESG credentials of a company.
Thanks, James. Tim, as we struggle to recover from the disruption brought by the pandemics, how can investors and companies turn it into an opportunity of transforming themselves into a future-proof business?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can speak from an investor perspective. So I think, first of all, pandemic is not an isolated event, and there were some studies showing climate change may lead to more events like this. So investor needs to have a systematic and integrated approach to tackle issues like this. So after the crisis, the society will be flooded with money because many governments are providing financial assistance to different industries and to the financial sector as well. So it is, first of all, it's great to see some government are already showing leadership for green recovery. So EU is setting 25% of the recovery budget for climate change investment. Canada also made the reporting climate risk as a condition of receiving COVID-19 funding. So with the funding, there will be many opportunities for investors and companies. So I think in terms of the investment themes after COVID-19, we will see more social themes emerging after the crisis, as Johnson and James already mentioned. And I also think some themes will quickly get attention, such as automation, because some jobs lost during the COVID-19 may be replaced by automation forever in China. So automation is a very exciting sector to watch. And I also think because of the remote working, maybe cybersecurity theme is also something that investors could pay attention to. So in terms of products, I also think some SDG related products tackling social challenges may be getting more and more attention from retail clients as well. So that's my comments.
St. Johnson?
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little bit on what Tim has just mentioned. I think crisis is definitely a shock to many companies, but there's some opportunity there as well. For one thing, crisis could really help us to identify materiality, because as Tim has just mentioned, many people see the pandemic as sort of a dry run for climate change. So it's like a dress rehearsal, and we can see from this kind of economic shock, how our business will be impacted from such kind of sudden shock and shutdown of our economy. And you can identify with this opportunity, what is vulnerable in your business and what parts of your business are fragile, and what would be needed to prepare to like be more resilient against these kind of like economic shocks from like ESG issues. So this is one thing that is a rare opportunity for people to really leverage to get prepared for future challenges. So this is one thing. Another thing is that COVID or the pandemic is a good opportunity for business to build relationship and trust with their stakeholders, because it's in time of crisis, you know, who are really supportive of you and who can really go through these challenges with you as a business. So it's a very good opportunity for a business to build relationship with their suppliers, with their employees, with their customers, and also their community, so that they know this is a trustworthy like business to work with. And I believe that is an important intangible asset if you think from a stakeholder capitalism perspective that would really build the long-term success of the companies. And these are some rare opportunities that you won't have like in a normal time.
Thanks, Johnson. James, do you have anything to add?
I think those were both, really excellent points made by Tim and Johnson. I think I'd certainly echo that last comment around stakeholder engagement and the value, particularly both at times of crisis, being able to rely on strong stakeholder relationships, but also following this crisis in terms of how you're responding, reflecting on the COVID and looking ahead, what steps you may need to take to kind of future-proof your organization. I think that those stakeholder relationships and an ongoing dialogue with these different stakeholders is a crucial part of that. So I think that's a very valuable takeaway as well.
Thanks, James. We've got some questions from the participant. So one of the questions is, the impact of pandemics depend on the sector. So the mostly affected companies are those related to tourism. It seems that pandemic would persist for a long time. So how does ESG elements help the companies to survive under this critical situation? Any panelists want to take this?
Perhaps I can add a very quick comment on this question. First of all, I want to emphasize that ESG is not a silver bullet. You can't solve all problems with ESG, and that's just so much it can help, like to be realistic. But in the case of pandemic, I want to emphasize here, like just what I a little bit mentioned, like the importance of trust and relationship with your stakeholders. Because when you think about tourism, you can't really have ESG to control the macro trend or the macro demand for tourism. It's not what ESG can promise you. But as we slowly recover from the pandemic, as the demand for tourism like grows back to normal, like who would recover faster than the others? If you think about this question, and you think about this question as a consumer, like who would you trust when you like start to go to a place, go to a restaurant or to a hotel, like after this pandemic? You would go for a hotel or restaurant that you believe or you know that they do value the health and safety of their customers. And that's not a kind of value you can just build like maybe over a week or a month. It's a value that you have to build over time, like from daily life, your daily experience with the customers. So this is something that ESG can help in building your relationship with the customers and building that trust in your business. And I believe it is not just during the time of pandemic, it should be something that is incorporated in your daily operation, into your strategy, into your governance, that you can really build a trustworthy business that is more resilient during the time of crisis.
Tommy, I just want to add on Johnson's comment. So I think Johnson is correctly pointed out that ESG is not a silver bullet, but then I also think companies who are in the tourism sector could emerge from this crisis stronger, maybe. So I think one of the trends that we are seeing in the tourism sector in particular is that many retail customers are focused on sustainable tourism after the crisis. I think one of the reasons is that they may focus more on lifestyle. They may have put more focus on green living as they revisit their values after the crisis. So I think if a company could survive the crisis and then they could make some changes to their strategies, and if they could focus more on themes related to sustainable tourism, then that may be an advantage to their business as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, we often talk about the risks, but we always need to be aware of the opportunities, as Tim's mentioned here. And I think, particularly in tourism, there are those kind of looking at your supply chains, looking at more for, your food, looking at local suppliers, locally grown produce, so these kind of aspects linking into that green lifestyle, which are going to become much more appealing, both to tourists themselves, but then also have the benefits in times of crisis when it looks at your sourcing and supply chains, for example, and how reliable those can be. So I think there's a number of different ways where it's kind of also looking at the opportunities that may emerge from this. And yes, some businesses are going to need to reevaluate their strategy. They're going to need to pivot. They're going to need to evolve. But that, in the same way we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about the oil and gas industry, there's going to be a transition that happens, and those that start to understand and adapt will be the ones that survive and thrive through this. So I think the same can be said in this circumstance for a lot of different industries and how they'll develop going forward.
Thank you, James. We are getting close to the end of our time together. I would like the panelists to give us a concluding remark. So, Johnson, if there's one thing you would like this audience to take away from this session, what would it be?
I think I would like to conclude by highlighting the importance of collaboration, because just like the pandemic, like climate change, or all these sustainability challenges cannot be solved by a single company or a single sector. It really takes collaboration across different business, different sectors, and also between business and policymakers, as well as other parties like academia and NGOs, to tackle these challenges. So I know there are a lot of friends from the corporates here today, and I want to encourage you to see ESG related regulation not as a compliance issue. Instead, you should really think about it as a collective investment plan. If we do all this together, it's better off for everybody. And the policymakers and regulators are just here to facilitate the whole process and to coordinate different efforts. So if you see this from this perspective, collaboration and the support from the corporate sector is a key to really get this happen and to really create a more sustainable future for the whole economy.
Thank you. Tim or James?
Yes, maybe I will go first. So I think the important takeaway for me is that we need to recognize that the crisis may delay many ESG initiatives in this space, because the priority is clearly on saving lives and also reopening the economy so that the business can survive. But I think it is also important that investors to remind the companies that even though the short-term priority may change, but it is important to ensure that ESG is not forgotten in long-term. So, and I also think historically after the crisis, there will be a new normal. So ESG will play a key role in the new normal, and I think it is up for the investor and companies to capture this opportunity and set up the ESG commitments.
Excellent. I mean, I think just to echo from what Tim and Johnson have said, I think what we're starting to see is the expectations both of companies, of investors, but also I think of governments in terms of how they're responding to this crisis is really starting to evolve. For investors and companies, this is coming not only from customers, clients, beneficiaries, but also the wider stakeholders that they're engaging and interacting with as well. And so I think the direction that we're seeing is this aligns very well with, I think, with responsible investment, with a consideration of these ESG issues. And as Johnson was touching on earlier, we're starting to see a lot more discussion around impact and outcomes as well. So for investors, and this hasn't as much become more mainstream in Asia yet, but particularly in Europe, talking about negative and positive outcomes and what actions investors can take, aligning, for example, to the SDGs. So I think this is a journey that's only going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to pick up space. Regulators are going to get more involved. But as we've mentioned, collaboration is going to be such a key part of this. And this is something I think we're all going to be working to try and drive more. So for everyone who's listening, I'd really encourage you to be open to that collaboration as well, where opportunities arise.
Thank you very much, James, Tim, and Johnson, for addressing this critical topic. I think we touched on some very important issues, and there are a lot of things that we can still talk about and really work together, achieving some critical objectives. On behalf of Herald community, we would like to thank you for your participation in this panel discussion. If we go to the next slide, before we finish, I'd like you to support Hong Kong ESG Reporting Awards. This is the third year we organized HERA. For the past 2 years, we have donated $60,000 Hong Kong dollars from the award submission fees to our beneficiary, Greenest Action. We still have 2 weeks time before the deadline, so don't miss the opportunity to communicate with your stakeholders and benchmark with your peers. We will continue to bring you webinars with topics that are of interest to the ESG industry. So stay tuned. Next slide. Great. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.